Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Institute of Export and International Trade on the future of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, also known as the TCA. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I'm delighted to be bringing you today's webinar on the pivotal post-Brexit trade deal. Now, on the next slide, we'll shortly start introducing today's speakers. Let's give it a second, thank you. So for those of you who are newer to our webinars, I've been hosting this program for several years, so you're hopefully in safe hands with me today. You're definitely in safe hands with Sandra Cooper, a customs and trade specialist at the Institute, who will be recapping what the TCA is shortly, including its purported benefits and some of the challenges traders have faced because of it. Sandra has 2 decades worth of experience in international trade, having previously worked at the Department for Business and Trade, and is also the Institute's leads on all things ESG and sustainability. On the next slide, we've also assembled a brilliant panel of trade policy experts to discuss the impact of the deal and to give insights into what might happen next over the next few years. We're delighted to welcome Fergus McReynolds onto the programme. Fergus is the Institute's Director for International and the EU. He has worked in Brussels for over a decade and has a wealth of experience and knowledge when it comes to the implications of trade policy on the industrial sector. We're also joined by 2 brilliant speakers from UK and a changing Europe. First off, welcome to Joel Redland, a research associate with a keen interest in post-Brexit regulatory divergence and the implementation and potential development of the TCA. And secondly, we're delighted to be joined by Jill Butter, a senior research fellow both at UK and a Changing Europe and at King's College, London, who has been programme director at the Institute for Government and who has vast experience working in the civil service across multiple government departments. And last and never least, it's great to welcome Alessandro Marongi, a senior trade policy manager at the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, also known as SMMT. Alessandro has a decade's worth of experience as a policy advisor in the UK auto sector, with a particular focus on trade deal negotiations, trade remedies, and market access issues, all of which sound pretty pertinent to today's webinar. So a brilliant panel, I hope you agree, and thank you to each of our panelists in advance for your contributions to today's discussions. On the next slide, before we get into the presentation, we're going to run a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So here asking, which of the following describes your trade with the EU? Has it grown since 2020? Has it remained the same? Has it shrunk? Has it stopped? Or maybe you never actually even traded between the UK and EU in the first place. So while you're answering that poll, just some quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window, and that's usually to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I will be prioritising questions that have relevance to the wider audience, and I won't be going into company-specific queries as such. Short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them. Finally, you will receive a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer the poll. 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Quite an even split. So just under a third of you has seen trade grow. Just another third of you has seen it remain the same. But a quarter have seen it shrink, and 5% of you saying it's stopped entirely since 2020. So a real spread there in terms of the impact of the Brexit and the trade deal on your trade since 2020. However, on the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Sandra, who's going to give a quick recap of what the TCA is, its benefits, and its challenges. So over to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Will. Thanks for the introduction and welcome. Well, I'll be talking to you very briefly, a little recap into what the EU-UK TCA is. And as we know, this Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a comprehensive accord that establishes preferential arrangements in various areas. Okay, in various areas such as, first of all, trading goods and services, investment, aspects like intellectual property, digital trade, public procurement, aviation, road transport, energy, fisheries, social security coordination, law enforcement, and some other judicial cooperation in criminal matters. Okay, this agreement is founded on provisions that guarantee a level playing field. You hear a lot of this in anything to do with the TCA, and respect for fundamental rights, okay, for both parties. So if we look at the next slide, please. The areas agreed, well, first of all, like I said, is tariffs, also the duties, which are the taxes that are collected by the government on imported goods, quotas, which are government imposed trade restrictions. That will limit the number and monetary value of certain goods that can be imported or exported during a particular period of time. Also investment, intellectual property, government procurement of goods, services on behalf of government agencies. Also technical standards and very important sanitary and phytosanitary issues. Okay, this will cover the food safety in regards of to avoid any bacterial contaminants, pesticides being included in food products that come in and out of countries. And the last one is environmental provisions. And environmental provisions is something that is quite popular in a way, to say it like that, but because now up to 85% of trade agreements have environmental provisions within the agreements, just so you know, and the TCA is one of them. As you can see, it's more than just a free trade agreement. It entails a lot more than that. The next slide, please. So what are the benefits of the EU-UK TCA? Well, first of all, tariff-free trade. The TCA ensures that most goods traded between the EU and the UK will be tariff-free, and this will promote the economic exchange. Customs facilitation, it simplifies customs procedures to reduce paperwork and any delays at borders. Remember, the aim of this is that things could continue as normal as it could. Continued access to markets, so businesses could benefit from continuing to build relationships, trade relationships with parties, with the other parties of the agreement, and cooperation in other areas like fisheries, security, and data protection. And if we look at the next slide, please. Well, this will impact you in terms of being able to use zero tariffs, and but also you will have to bear and take into consideration the rules of origin, okay? And this is the rules of origin are there to establish the economic nationality of the goods that are being traded. And goods that are imported from elsewhere, okay, they will be subject to customs duty, or if they don't meet the criteria for the rules of origin. Also, we'll have new customs formalities between the UK and the EU, such as customs declarations and customs procedures. And also product compliance with EU and UK standards. So there is a definition of international standard and recognition of international standards across the borders. Okay, so that's how it impacts you. And the next slide, just to finish with this section, what are the major challenges? You know, we listen to people and what they have to say. So one of them would be the red tape, what they call bureaucracy. And that's what they are finding. Okay, shipping and transport issues like delays in shipping and transportation, they have affected the trade flows between the EU and the UK. And this can lead to increased costs and supply chain challenges. Also, customs and border controls that are now applicable and are in place, that they have been gradually been introduced, to be honest, and labor and environmental issues, as this is a very, very significant challenge for the trade and cooperation agreement. And that's just me for now. Remember, so this is what we heard from most people.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Sandra. That's a great recap of the deal. So lots happened over the last few years. That's a really good snapshot there. We'll bring the panel in shortly, but before we do, we're already getting some great questions coming in from the audience. So Sandra, if I may, one that's come in from Amy. Amy asks, how do I navigate the rules of origin in the deal, and how much do the rules differ per sector?
I think first you need to become very familiar with what rules of origin are. Okay, that's the main thing. You need to understand, for example, what's the local content of a product that you are intending to export or import. Okay, how complex is the manufacturing process? But just to give you a few like a checklist, you know, understand the rules. Like I said, determine if your product is eligible to claim origin. Okay, documentation, become familiar as well with the documentation, because you will have, even if you're claiming preferential origin of some of the goods, you need to have the paperwork to prove that they actually meet that criteria. You need to understand that there will be certain compliance checks that will take place. And, you know, remember, it will vary depending on the sector, okay? Depending on, like I said, the manufacturing complexity, the nature of the goods, and the supply chain integration. So it is very important to analyze sector-specific rules.
Thank you, Sandra. It's one of those areas we have whole training courses on rules of origin. So if there's any further questions, we'll point people towards those resources. But thank you. I hope that's helpful, Amy, and indeed anyone else who's been asking questions on origin. At this point, though, on the next slide, it is my delight to bring on our panel of policy experts for the first time as we look at what the impact of TCA has been so far. So, Joelle, if I can begin with yourself, thank you for joining us today. Sandra's given an overview of what the TCA has set out to do. To what extent do you think the TCA has succeeded in providing for frictionless trade between the UK and EU?
I mean, clearly it doesn't. I don't think anyone would ever have expected it to, because the non-tariff barriers that it creates, the trade bureaucracy, paperwork, the checks were entirely foreseeable, and the impacts have been largely predictable. I think it's helpful to differentiate maybe between the different types of trade frictions there have been on different types of traders. So the first main thing to say is that UK goods exports have suffered more than services. UK goods exports have declined by 8% since 2019. To be honest, that's part of a global trend, and there are other factors affecting that, including the pandemic and Ukraine. But the UK has performed worse than comparable economies on goods. And clearly a reason for that is going to be the TCA bureaucracy. And whilst overall volumes have stayed relatively strong, what we're seeing is smaller firms in particular, the number of sort of business-to-business connections across the channel have reduced significantly, because smaller firms can't navigate the bureaucracy in the way that a large firm can. And so that bears out to some extent in the numbers now, but also I think we need to think longer term, because smaller businesses today ideally would grow, would develop links and expand, and so it has a longer term drag on UK growth, UK trade performance as well. So that's one thing to be mindful of, whereas services is actually quite an interesting question as to why they've been better able to navigate the bureaucracy. I think part of it is to do with the fluidity of the ways in which services can be exported, that you can use intermediaries, subsidiaries, Zoom meetings. You don't have to necessarily get a good across the board all the time. So I think that's part of the reason why services have done better, but it's a more complex picture than that. And then I think it's also worth thinking about the future and the fact that these frictions aren't set in stone today. There are going to be new complications down the line, firstly because the UK is still introducing its own border control regime on EU imports into GB. We're only really halfway there. The government has delayed the full implementation of the April round of controls that was meant to come in. That's going to add further friction onto imports, EU imports, and we don't yet know what the full impact will be of that, but it could be similarly sort of, you know, troublesome as when the EU imposed those reciprocal checks back in 2021. And there's also the question of regulatory divergence and the fact that the EU continues to introduce new legislation, and that will continue to add new frictions at the border. The CBAM is probably the most obvious example of something that's coming in, which is going to is already creating new paperwork, and in future could impose new tariffs as well. But there are other regulations as well, like the packaging directive, which changes how you have to package your goods to get them across into the EU. Potentially have two different forms of packaging depending on where you're sending your good. These are just these little kind of, well, actually quite significant in this case, but lots of little frictions which are going into supply chains, production processes that just make trading life harder, and that will not stop as long as UK and EU are separate jurisdictions.
Thank you, Joel. I mean, just even today, in terms of the controls coming in on the UK side, belatedly or having been postponed, this is, I think, headline of the Guardian today was about the impact of those new import controls on sanitary and phytosanitary goods entering the UK. It's still being a lot of teething issues there, so it's a live situation for sure. I mean, Fergus, just bring you in terms of businesses you kind of been working with for the Institute on both sides of the channel, kind of how have businesses been responding to the DCA over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, really following on from what Joel has said, I think that there's a different, there's a range of different responses from businesses, and we've seen that from the polling evidence on this call today. It's fair to say, and you have to acknowledge the fact that under the current and new trading relationships, there are some business models which just do not suit that sort of relationship, and the barriers which have been created are too high a hurdle to be able to overcome. So trade has stopped in some instances. It has to be recognized. There are some business models that really do not fit the new relationship. I think it's also fair to say that the counterfactual for the trade and cooperation agreement should probably be no deal. While it doesn't feel like that, because we went from trading inside the customs union and inside the single market to one day and then the following day not being, but those were political decisions which had been made long before the deal itself was struck. And actually, in comparison to leaving without a deal, the TCA does provide a considerable amount of facilitation to enable that trade. I understand and completely appreciate it doesn't feel like that on the ground in reality. And what we're seeing is really indicative of the fact that there's been quite a lot of uncertainty. While businesses have come to terms with the mechanics of international trade, from understanding rules of origin and understanding customs declarations, there has been friction in the system in terms of delays in those processes, but also just not knowing when changes will be coming on board. There's been a lack of cooperation under the agreement between the two parties because there's been a huge amount of political instability for a variety of reasons, not least ongoing discussions about the future state of Northern Ireland. But that has meant that the cooperative elements of the trade and cooperation agreement haven't been fully enacted to provide the sort of certainty that businesses want. John also made reference to the fact that there's an asymmetry in some of the relationships businesses in the UK or in Great Britain trading into the EU have had to fulfill obligations of third country exporters and importers into the EU market in a way that those on the EU side trading into GB haven't had the same level of requirement to meet market regulations and in uncertainty. So what we're seeing in terms of the companies that we're working with, A, some businesses where the new model just doesn't work. B, where businesses have existing relationships, they have worked with customer and supplier relationships to try and bridge some of those. And yes, the reality is it takes longer and it costs more, and there are more uncertainties in that relationship. That is leading on to the sort of impact C, which is a challenge around finding new business and some perception that it is more difficult in some instances than it actually is. But I think that perception is absolutely driven from uncertainty and a lack of clarity in terms of how the relationship will go forward. I think what Joel's points, particularly around divergence and the potential for additional frictions, highlights is those cooperation mechanisms really need to be ramped up. We need to get much better sight at what's coming down the line from a regulatory perspective on both sides, so that businesses have the time it needs for them to prepare for any new obligations. That sort of pipeline of seeing what changes are coming is really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Fergus. And just to It was great, Alessandro has been able to join us from the SMNT today. I mean, the auto sector in particular has been impacted by the rules of origin, which Sandra was referring to earlier, some of the processing rules within the TCA. Could you say a little bit about how the sector has been dealing with the fallout from the trade deal so far?
Yes. Well, I would distinguish between impacts in the immediate aftermath of the agreement and medium-term ones. And on short-term impacts, I want to bring back some painful memories from 2021, I would say. We should all remember that the conclusion of the TCA was announced on Christmas Eve 2020, 7 days before the end of the so-called transition period. And there was virtually no time to even polish the text, and let alone time for businesses to familiarize with elements of the deal that essentially could be known only upon disclosure, and that included origin requirements. Now, the SMNT essentially spent months at the beginning of 2021 simply supporting businesses in explaining the terms of the deal, and the biggest immediate impact, at least origin-wise, was felt by distributors and aftermarket suppliers, because the realization that businesses that do not manufacture in the EU or in the UK or otherwise further processed goods simply cannot qualify for preferential treatment was a real shocker at that time. There was some temporary flexibility on providing supporting documentation for preferential origin claims, but businesses needed to be reasonably certain about the origin of their goods to claim zero tariff treatment. Now, in many cases, that certainty simply didn't exist, and many suppliers pretty much refused to declare preferential origin without having that certainty. So obviously, businesses ended up paying tariffs. Now, I think that the worst of those short-term impacts is pretty much behind us, either because businesses have largely adjusted, either because they can comply or they change distribution channels, or they factor in tariffs, or cease to trade with the EU entirely if there was no available alternative solution. And with regard to midterm impacts, obviously the most high-profile case was regarded rules of origin for electric vehicles, hybrids, and battery parts, with a lot of uncertainty looming on automotive businesses until December 23 last year. I guess working on Christmas is becoming a bit of a tradition, but the extension of these origin rules, of facilitative origin rules, for another 3 years has pretty much resulted in many automotive manufacturers, breathing a sigh of relief, at least on a temporary basis.
Yeah, so I remember the 2020 Christmas Eve, or was it 2021? I get confused with the years, but yeah, that was a fun Christmas to try and digest the trade deal between Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, and New Year's Day. Flashbacks on there. I mean, an overall trend I'm getting so far is there's been a lot of uncertainty since the deal's come in, and partly that's because of delays in some of the implementation, but also short time frames in terms of when new things are being brought in. So that seems a theme so far. I mean, Jill, just to bring you into the discussion now, let's look at the broader relationship. Fergus and Joel have referred to some of the aspects of the deal which maybe haven't been fully fulfilled around cooperation. I mean, what sort of relationship has been created by the trade deal, and kind of what challenges has the deal presented for UK-EU relations over the last few years?
Well, the journey's been, the relationship has been on a bit of a roller coaster, I think it's fair to say, since the TCA was signed. It went through that sort of deep freeze period when the Johnson government put David Frost in charge of chairing the Partnership Council, and the Joint Committee was set to renege on elements of the Northern Ireland Protocol, unilaterally extended grace periods, and the Commission basically put the UK, save for geopolitical considerations like Ukraine, pretty much into a deep freeze. And I think what we've seen since then is a thawing, first to some extent under Liz Truss as Foreign Secretary, then much more accelerated with Rishi Sunak and negotiation of the Windsor Framework. But I don't think it's a relationship that at the highest level, Rishi Sunak is, I think he has quite a good working relationship with Ursula von der Leyen, but it's not one that people are investing vast amounts of time and effort in. And essentially, it's a sort of functioning transactional relationship, I think, at the moment. And I think one of the things be very interesting, focusing on Alessandro's read on it, even though it was clear there was going to be a deal on the rules of origin, that Germany very much wanted it, German car manufacturers, UK car manufacturers, even that could not be signed off in the summer when everybody was agreed, when the manufacturer said, this is when it'd be really helpful for us to know. It wasn't either a high enough priority or everybody felt it had to sort of go to the brink. So I think we're still seeing sort of, a functioning relationship. It's quite interesting that at last year's Conservative Party conference, the EU's ambassador to the UK, Pedro Serrano, was on a platform with Andrea Leadsom, one of the leading lights of the Brexit campaign on the UK side, now restored as a government minister. But they were both pretty content with the way the TCA is going. There's sort of not much change here. It covers our trade, it's functioning. Meanwhile, business people in the audience and Peter Foster, public policy editor of the FT, author of What Went Wrong with Brexit, were sort of making points from the sidelines that it might be all right at a political level and meet the political needs of both sides, but it was not terribly satisfactory if you were using that as the basis for an effective trading relationship, for the reasons Joel put out, that it's introduced a lot of friction where there weren't frictions before.
And to put it to the panel, are a lot of the issues which come as a result of the deal basically due to this disconnect between the political level of the trade deal and the business and the business community's kind of a reaction to it? Is that kind of the stemming of the problem for businesses, that disconnect?
I think, Will, as part of it, I think that from a business perspective, the ideal situation you're in trading is the highest level of certainty and the swiftest application of any administrative burden. And where we identify challenges, that the policymakers who are responsible for them action those as quickly as possible to provide that certainty going forward. But I think the reality of the world that we are in, this is a significant change in a huge trading relationship, not just for the UK and the EU, but for the UK and 27 member states of the EU. So some of the challenges have not just been at the political level, they've been at the functional level, that as a third country, while you deal with the EU in inverted commas, you also deal with the 27 member states who individually manage all of their own customs requirements. There are different tax requirements, there are different requirements in terms of trading into some of those countries. So there is a part of this which is also functional of the sort of relationship that you have as a third country with the EU, and that's to be recognised. But the politics haven't made this easy. The TCA, as I've said, does have a range of mechanisms that allow for cooperation, for discussion of some of these challenges, be those at the highest political level with the Partnership Council or the sort of more technical level of the trade specialised committees. And they really haven't been functioning as well as they should have been to identify how we collectively overcome some of these challenges. The hope is now, as Jill has set out, the relationship is improving. It's certainly unthawing from the harshest period that we saw, and we are starting to see these cooperation mechanisms deliver. What I think is still quite clear is that there's a little bit of uncertainty on the horizon because of the politics in both parties.
William, just to add to what Fergus was saying, the UK, I think, particularly on the agri-food side, is creating a network of envoys or attaches in embassies trying to speak bilaterally to, whether it's customs authorities, regulatory authorities, about the different ways individual member states are interpreting some of the new obligations under the TCA, to see whether there is progress there and actually just making the day-to-day easier. Interesting to see whether that initiative makes progress. But I think one of the things we have seen as a general theme from the British government is that in many ways they sort of have defaulted towards trying to sort things out bilaterally rather than trying to go through the Commission. That may be a bit of a legacy and a bit of a hangover from the times when the relationship really got incredibly difficult. And I think under the sort of Johnson Frost, if you like, philosophy, was that as sovereign nations, we preferred talking to other individual countries than dealing with the EU as an institution.
Oh, well, it's been a bit of a ride, kind of just going back through the last few years of kind of all the different names and all the different stages of the relationship as outlined by Jill just then as well. So we're going to move on from the past and we'll come on to the future in a moment. So thank you for the panel so far. But on the next slide, before we do go into the next stage of the webinar, I'm just going to do a quick plug to say that if you'd like to learn more about how to trade between the UK and EU, please do check out the Institute's training courses on just this. We have courses on both UK exports into Europe and goods moving the other way from the EU to here in Britain. I'll post a link to the courses in the chat in a moment, and you can say in the next poll if you'd like to receive further information from the Institute about these courses. There's also a QR code on the slide at the moment, so I'll leave that on for a couple of seconds and then I'll launch the poll in. Okay, just while people are answering that poll, just a reminder that our webinars are recorded and posted onto our YouTube channel and onto the website export.org.uk. We run regular webinars on all matters trade and customs, including recent sessions on the future of customs IT in the UK, the new import controls that have been brought in under the border target operating model and are still being brought in, and some of the major supply chain risks traders need to know about this year. I'll post a link in the chat as well shortly to the YouTube channel in case you want to watch back any of these sessions. I'll leave the poll open for just a couple more seconds before we move on to the future of the trade deal. So I'll do a short countdown, 10, not 10, what am I thinking? 3, 2, 1. Everyone who responded to that. At this one vote, on the next slide, I'd like to welcome back Sandra, who's going to give a recap of what is going to happen next for the TCA as set out within the agreement itself. So over to you, Sandra.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So if we move into the next slide, because what I'm going to talk to you about is about the 2026 review of the EU-UK TCA. And there are, we are in the world of the maybes at the moment, because there are different potential approaches can be available for this review. And the simple one is just the review of the TCA as it currently stands, which will be a very straightforward assessment into what the TCA is at the moment, and this can be integrated just in their annual and biannual implementation reports. And for what I've heard and read, this is like the approach that is consistent with what the EU has currently in mind in terms of the review. Then there's improving the current TCA in terms of improving the governance frameworks of the agreement and addressing unfulfilled commitments. Okay, and the last one would be to broaden or make enlarge the scope of the agreement. Okay, and this in this one we could have the opportunity to make the scope bigger of the TCA and to get other areas involved, such as veterinary agreements of mutual recognition of conformity assessments and professional qualifications. Okay, something important that is also discussed is youth mobility and foreign and security policy. So these are potential approaches. If we move to the next next slide, please. And these are some lines of action that could improve implementation of the TCA. And for what I've just heard with the, with this, with the panel, this is important because first of all, addressing unforeseen circumstances or deficiencies that have emerged with the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, making sure that the Windsor framework is also implemented correctly. Also strengthening, as well as Jill mentioned, and strengthening EU and UK political relations. Okay, there's a lot of room for improvement into that, and there are already discussions happening at the moment at a political level and diplomatic levels for this to improve. Then we would have the greater trade facilitation for business predictability, and that's something else. Unpredictability is a killer in terms of the TCA, but this is some areas where we could improve, as well as that, and the EU to focus more on promoting relations on a subnational level, to avoid any bottlenecks when you are just treating everything at supranational level or national level. So, and another thing, it would be to work more, and this is my remit, into the climate agenda. This is a global agenda. We all are here for the same purpose, and we need to make sure that the UK regulatory regulations are a lot clearer. Okay, and because the EU is fearing that if the UK lowers their environmental standards in a way, that would affect directly the EU. And the last, if we go to the next slide, please. So what are the main changes here? Well, one is that the deadline of July 2026 for reciprocal access to waters for fisheries. As we know, 25% of the EU quota in the UK waters have been gradually transition into UK access. Both parties will have access to each other's waters through a licensing system for fishing vessels. And obviously, after 2026, that's the deadline when negotiations on access and share of stocks will take place annually. And obviously, if there's any problems arising, there will be some arbitration available for that. Another one of the changes is and you were mentioning before about electric vehicles and batteries. So 31st of December 2026 is now the deadline for the extension on product-specific rules of origin. Okay, it's an extension that was put in place to stop the tariff cliff edge that was set for the 1st of January 2024 in terms of the rules of origin that are product-specific. And that's me.
Perfect. Thank you, Sandra. Get myself in someone's line by this. Someone just needs to mute themselves quickly. So we'll run another couple quick fire polls. So the next one is going to ask you, what should the UK government be prioritising in reference to the UK-EU relationship? The options being reviewing the TCA, regulatory divergence from the EU, trade facilitation within the TCA, new agreements outside of it, like the SBS ones just mentioned, or if you want to say other, please just say in the comments what you mean by other. Sandra, while people are answering that, we've had a good question just come in from Theo. Theo asks, or Theo says, the EU is also looking to reform its customs operations over the next few years. What does this entail and how could it impact the trade deal?
Okay, I think this is well mainly and this is when I bring all the time I bring CBAM to these things, but the EU this customs regulation is all about putting together a package of reforms that is going to simplify and modernize the EU customs union. Okay, make things easier, everything more standardized, but that could affect the agreement or the way we trade, the UK and the EU, if we don't standardize or have a certain homologation of the way we do things in terms of trade here in the UK. One example for me would be as well like they can do all they want in the EU and improve things, but we also need to put our own work here. For example, just an example, the CBAM is meant to be like a very big issue now, could be a big issue with the Northern Ireland Protocol, okay, in terms of trading with Northern Ireland and the EU. Why? Because we have two very different, or they're trying to make it very similar, carbon adjustment mechanisms, okay? But if you see the carbon prices, for example, per ton in the EU is a lot different. It's like £52 a ton, when here in the UK is £40, and that's just the beginning of it. Okay, so it really is about the standardization by both parties. If we want this to work and we want this modernization in the EU to not be affected, they won't be very impressed.
Thank you, Sandra. And interestingly, just going to share the results of that first poll. So in terms of what people are looking for the future of the UK-EU relationship, trade facilitation within the deal is the majority votes, 53%. Reviewing the deal itself is 27%. Only 14% thinking agreements outside of TCA, and only 6% saying regulatory divergence as well. So really interesting response there. Thank you everyone for responding. I'm going to launch a very similar poll now, as we commented already. This one's going to ask what do you think the new EU Commission should be prioritising. So the options are review of the TCA, customs reform, as just outlined by Sandra, CBAM, ESG and deforestation, also spoken about just now, supply chain due diligence, and then again, if you want to say other, please do say in the comments. So at this point, we'll bring the panel back on just as people are answering that poll. So welcome back to Fergus, Joao, Jill, and Alessandro. To begin this part of the conversation, and Joao, it's interesting because as a quarter of people said the review of the TCA is their priority for the UK government and the poll just now, but the review is scheduled to begin in May 2026. What does it entail? Should it be viewed as a renegotiation, or is it more of a stock take?
So I think Sandra did a really good job of outlining the three core potential paths that the review could take. And for the time being, the most likely scenario is that it is just a very light touch review, because that is the EU's clear preferred position. I think the focus on the TCA review in general, however, has become something of a red herring in terms of thinking about the future of the relationship. It was talked up a bit by the Labour Party last year about using the review to go page by page through the TCA, looking for all these ways that we can facilitate better trade access. But I think that was primarily a rhetorical device to signal that A, Labour is committed to improving the function of the TCA, but B, it wants to work within Boris Johnson's deal rather than ripping it up. It's like, look, we're going to use the provisions in place, very clearly trying to say we're not about renegotiation, fundamentally changing the terms of the relationship. And I think actually when we get into the detail, it doesn't make that much sense to use the TCA review if you want to either sort of optimize or deepen the functioning of the TCA. First reason is because the EU is quite hostile to it, and they don't budge easily from these positions. Secondly, why would you wait till 2026? If Labour is going to be elected, it will be towards the end of this year. Why would you wait over a year before you start your negotiations? And thirdly, you don't need to use the review. Like you can make changes to the TCA in other ways. A really salient example is the fact that the EU just came out with its proposal for a mobility agreement, which would be a classic example of deepening the TCA by adding a supplementing agreement. They didn't wait for some set piece review to do that. They just said, okay, we're interested in this thing, here's our initial proposal, and then you would move on from that. So if you do want to deepen relations, you don't have to use a review. I think the key strategic question for Labour is, how do you go about trying to add new elements to the TCA if that's what you want to do? Because one option is to kind of pick things off one by one in narrow agreements, sort of in the way the EU's done here with mobility. And so to say, okay, we want an SPS agreement, here's our initial proposal, you go where you have talks, and so you work through it as an isolated negotiation. But you could also try and package up a number of things and say, okay, here are the three things which we want to add. And potentially what you have there is the ability to create more trade-offs, because obviously the EU, actually we've written a report on this, which you can find on our website, which kind of explains that the EU's thinking doesn't have much interest in dealing with TCA. It's got a lot of other things on its plate. So if it's going to come to the table, you need to be offering clear incentives. A mobility agreement would be one thing. enhanced security cooperation might be another thing. And so if you try and package it up into a single negotiation where you say, okay, bit of mobility here, a bit of SPS there, and so you group it together and you work it through systematically, maybe that increases the UK's negotiating leverage. So yeah, I think that's really the question, is not about when and how the TCA review is used, but what is the most optimal means for Labour to pursue these kind of additions, if that is indeed what it wants to do, if it does indeed get elected.
Joel, obviously, as you say, it's all hypotheticals at this stage, despite the polls. We'll move to the next slide quickly, sorry, just so we've got our panel back on screen. I mean, actually, just to come back to that question, Joel, question came in from Catherine. Catherine said, is there a list of kind of elements in the TCA which will be up for renegotiation? Is there that sort of list kind of separate to the review, or is it, as you say, there will be kind of potentially space for kind of smaller agreements to kind of refine parts of the deal?
Yeah, so the things that are up for renegotiation or review, they are, independent of the TCA review. They just have deadlines built into them. Again, I would steer you towards our report reviewing the TCA, which I think does flag those deadlines. Otherwise, we have another report which covers them as well. The big one is fisheries, and critically, that expires. The provisions expire on the same day as energy cooperation. The reason that is the case is because back in 2020, the EU was worried about the UK kicking up a fuss over fish, and so saying, okay, energy expires on the same day is effectively a threat to say, if you don't sort of give in a bit on fish, then we risk damaging our energy cooperation and not renewing those terms. I think the picture has changed significantly post-Ukraine, where the UK and the EU are, they are critically, strategically interdependent on one another, and I don't think anyone wants to see the energy cooperation provisions expire. But it could get quite messy if you're doing fish in parallel. So those are probably the two biggest deadlines, but there are other deadlines as well. There's rules of origin in 2027, and there's also unilateral policies which will have an effect. So the EU State Adequacy Agreement decision for the UK expires in June 2025. That will have a big effect on services trade if it's not renewed, and there are other ones beyond that. So there are lots of little things which will constantly pop up and need dealing with, and I think that really is going to be the bread and butter of the relationship. Even under Labour, it would be mostly about servicing lots of dates and deadlines which come up to the surface and need to be managed so as not to complicate relations. Northern Ireland is another area. There's the expiry of the grace period on veterinary medicines. We have the consent vote at the end of this year in the Northern Ireland Assembly on the provisions which apply EU law. So there's all these dates bubbling up, and that's just a reality of life managing a quite broad legal trade agreement.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think in terms of some of the areas that have been identified for priorities in terms of both review or addressing under the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement set up a mechanism known as the Domestic Advisory Group, shorthand DAG for those who are closer to it. But the Domestic Advisory Group, there's one on each side. There's one on the EU and there's one in the UK, and it takes representation from business groups, from trade unions, from other third sector interested parties. And both the EU Domestic Advisory Group and the UK Domestic Advisory Group have both published recently reports on priority areas for further cooperation. So that would also give you a good indication of some of the areas that outside of the agreement, the set dates that Joel has gone through, there are a list of priorities which industry, trade unions and other interested parties have put on the table as well. So it's worth reviewing those.
Thank you, Fergus. I mean, I'm conscious, I want to kind of move along because we've spoken a bit about the electric vehicle batteries and the origin requirements there. So Alessandro, could you come in and just say a little bit more about kind of, the implications of that deadline that's been postponed by a number of years? Kind of where's the sector in relation to the postponement of that deadline, that cliff edge, as it's widely reported to be framed as? Kind of what's the latest thinking on that one?
The baseline is that rules of origin can unlock free trade only if they reflect the parties' regional value chains. Now, at the time of negotiations, the EU and the UK achieved a quite remarkable result because they acknowledged that the regional supply chain for the production of batteries and EVs was not sufficiently developed to meet most common precedents. So they decided to set exceptionally simple origin requirements on a 3-year basis for batteries, battery parts, and all types of electrified vehicles. Now, rules of origin, simplified rules of origin for batteries are particularly important because batteries are the most valuable part that is incorporated into a purely electric vehicle in particular. So allowing batteries to qualify meant that a finished vehicle had a much greater chance to avoid tariffs as well. Now, unfortunately, delayed investment in the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, and the sort of poisonous fallout on supply chains worldwide essentially made the phasing of much tougher origin requirements at the beginning of this year absolutely unworkable. And we estimated essentially that the phasing of new rules would have resulted in additional tariff bills for £4.3 billion between 2024 and 2026. Now, as you mentioned, at the end of last year, the UK and the EU successfully concluded an agreement to extend the existing rules of origin that essentially allow a battery to be assembled from imported parts and components and get originating status. And that essentially avoids the risk of a 10% tariff to be applied on finished battery electric vehicles. Now, while this extension is vital, essentially, yes, to safeguard regional EV trade, much tougher origin requirements will be phased in January 2027. Now, as part of this agreement to extend existing rules, the EU and the UK also agreed to scrap a review mechanism that was separate from the general one that was scheduled for 2025, and essentially no further changes to the relevant origin rules can be approved before 2032. So rules that are set to kick in 2027 are pretty much set in stone at the moment. So continued tariff-free trade for EVs will largely depend on the ability of the parties to localize production of batteries, yes, but most importantly, cells, modules, and relevant battery parts. And so localization cannot be limited to the assembly of batteries, but we have to make sure that battery manufacturers will also localize production of originating cathodes, anodes, the relative active cathode materials, other parts such as separators and electrolytes. And I cannot tell right now whether the industry and the battery industry in particular will be in good shape by the end of 2026 to allow us to meet these very challenging origin rules.
It's a fascinating area. I mean, on a global level as well as the UK-EU relationship, also there's the US-China stuff going on as well, just I see them having a significant fee. I just want to move session along a little bit again. I have some questions, unsurprisingly, come through about the elections this year. So Sophie is among those who's asked, what possibility is there of an election in the UK this year? I mean, I think everyone's trying to pin down the date. We know it's probably this year, but it could be January next. I mean, Jill and Fergus, I guess it'd be great to bring you both on this. There's elections on both sides of the channel. Yep. As Joel mentioned earlier, there's a lot of talk about a possible Labour government coming in the UK. I mean, what potential impact could the elections have on the UK-EU relationship and the trade deal in general? If I begin with Jill on this one.
Okay, well, I'll take the UK election since Fergus is based in Brussels, so peculiarly well placed to talk about the European Parliament and other European elections that might affect things. So we don't know the date of the election. I think the smart money is on November the 14th. I think it might be a bit earlier if the EU really does go ahead with introducing the entry and exit system. the digital border at the end of October, because I think that could lead to some very horrible pictures out of the ferry ports across Channel, and they might want to avoid those, but who knows? So people are thinking the autumn. I think the Prime Minister has narrowed his second half of the year. I think earlier this week he said, and it will be this year, so ruling out January 2025, at least that's what people think, though he does still have the option of going to January 2025. So election in the second half, interesting interplay with potential time, with the timing of the US election, where we know exactly when that will be. Will be a week, the same week, a week later, quite much. Anyway, it looks as though one of our colleagues, John Curtis, well-known pollster, says it's 99% probable that Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister, either leading a majority Labour government, or what current polls indicate, or leading some sort of minority government or coalition. So who knows? Where will it go on the relationship? Obviously, two things I think are at play. One, there's none of the same set of baggage that the current government has in relation to the EU relationship. And there's no equivalent in the Labour Party of the big conservative Eurosceptic wing that we see as part of the discourse. So there's, in that sense, more freedom of manoeuvre. Indeed, if Keir Starmer comes under any pressure from his party, it will be towards a closer relationship than the EU. But at the moment, for the election, he is saying that he still rules out rejoining either the customs union. There's a bit of a flurry of speculation about that over the past couple of weeks. Was Labour planning to rejoin the customs union? No rejoining the customs union, no rejoining the single market, no reintroduction of free movement, which is why Labour reacted really quickly to that kite being flown with that Commission proposed negotiating mandate on a mobility agreement that was misrepresented in the UK press as the EU is proposing to reintroduce free movement for under 30s between the UK and the EU. So certainly this side of the election, we're going to see things about foreign and security cooperation, where David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said, yes, we should do more. We will talk about improving the Brexit agreement, making Brexit work, potentially doing some sort of veterinary deal, which is also helpful for Northern Ireland to help the agri-food business, maybe knocking some of the sort of difficulties off, trying to reduce some frictions. Labour has said it wants things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, but I think we won't really know seriously where they're at until the other side of an election. I realise time is running out, so I'm going to hand the baton over to Fergus.
Just as that baton's passed, Fergus, I'm just going to share the results of the last poll, which was about the EU's priorities for the future relationship, which might be quite informative as well. So the TCA review being top, followed by customs reform. So Fergus, over to you to talk Brussels and the parliamentary elections.
Absolutely. I mean, a little bit more certainty and certainly a little bit more urgency in terms of the European elections. So they will take place over 5 days at the beginning of June. So the first full weekend in June, we'll see the European parliamentary elections, and that will essentially form the basis of the beginning of the new mandate for the European Union. What will take place after that is the formation of the political groupings within the European Parliament. And I think it's fair to say that the largest group will be and remains to be, as it is today, the centre-right grouping of the EPP. Although that group is likely to be smaller than it is in the current Parliament. So I think there will be a lot of analysis that needs to take place in terms of what the future constellation of the European Parliament looks like. But the first job on the table will be looking at creating a European Commission based on the nomination of a Commission President. At the moment, the front runner being Ursula von der Leyen, who will go for a second term. Still not a hammered-on certainty, but the most likely person who will lead the Commission, and then each of the commissioners will need to be appointed. What that all means in reality in terms of the UK-EU relationship is that the focus of the EU for the second half of this year, and the focus in Brussels, will be the constitution of the Parliament, the creation of the groups, the election of each of the key post holders in the Parliament, and then the formation of the Commission. That is likely to be because of the political change in the European Parliament, with a potential growth on the right of the centre-right in the hard right parties, and a reduction in other areas of the Parliament and some of those reconstitutions. That casting of a new commission and the hearings and creating of a new college is likely to take a lot longer than is currently envisaged. The idea would be to have that in place by November. It's much more likely that that won't be until December. So that focus means that the EU will be very much looking at that in the second half of this year. So the space to talk about changes to the UK relationship will be limited. That means that although the EU election takes place considerably earlier, the time when actually the two parties will be able to sit down with a new UK government potentially and certainly a new commission will not be until the beginning of 2025. So there's a bit of time for us to look at establishing what the priorities might be on both sides. What's not clear at the moment is where that relationship will sit for the UK, because the Brexit process bridged the mandates between 2014 and into the 2019 mandate. It was a huge political issue. And let's be very honest with ourselves, there are considerably bigger political priorities for Europe at the moment, with war on the continent, between the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, challenges across the world in terms of geopolitics, the impact for Europe of the US election and what that will mean to its relationship. You know, the world is not the same as it was in 2017. It's not the same as it was in 2019. And I think that there are a lot of things which are will take the EU's priority, and Brexit won't necessarily, or the UK relationship, apologies, won't necessarily be the #1 issue. It's also fair to say that because of that, the political focus and the appetite for experienced political actors in Brussels to want to be associated with the UK relationship, it isn't going to be career making as it perhaps was in the 2019 mandate. So that will also be a challenge in terms of keeping it on the agenda. So I think we will have to play for time. I think we'll recognise that in terms of the UK-EU relationship and substantial change under the new Commission and the new government, that really doesn't start until the first half of 2025. That doesn't mean that we can't do anything in the interim, but it will be a lot of non-political technical work which will take place between now and then. But it's that constellation of key questions. What does the European Parliament look like? How long does it take to create a new commission and have them all sworn in? What are the priorities of that commission given by each of the member states to them to focus on in the next 5 years? And where does the UK relationship sit? Not just strategically, but quite literally, physically within the mechanics of the commission. We don't know. Will there be a commissioner who will be responsible for the relationship? Will there be a vice president who's responsible for the relationship? All of these things at the moment are unanswered questions. So it's going to be a fascinating year in terms of the politics. And it will all be playing out at the same time in the autumn of this year, with the UK election, with the US election, and the formation of a new commission.
Thank you, Fergus, and thank you to Jill as well for the kind of the election take. But we have run over, so from the past to the future and back to the present. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start wrapping up. So on the next slide, actually, first of all, just another big thank you to Sandra for the presentation, Fergus, Joelle, Jill, Alessandro. Some really great discussion there. So thank you for giving your fantastic insights. I hope everyone has found that conversation as stimulating as I have. A quick reminder, the Institute provides plenty of support for businesses involved in exporting, importing and customs, including webinars like this. Membership at the Institute gives you access to a range of benefits, help your business succeed overseas, whether that's exclusive access to our lunchtime learning webinars, which go into kind of topics like this in a bit more detail, discounts on our training courses, exclusive guides and insights on trade trends and regulatory changes, access to our team of trading customs experts via our technical helpline, as well as networking opportunities with fellow traders and trade professionals. You can go to the website for more information on all of this support. Next slide, please. Here you'll see some of our upcoming webinars and events. So in terms of the member exclusive sessions, we're going to be doing an in-depth look on reporting and auditing supply chains, so really practical session there. That's on Thursday next week, the 23rd of May. Our next free webinar will be an introduction to customs classification, one of the key tasks any business needs to deal with if they are in cross-border trade. So that's on June 12th. And finally, a shout out for our annual members conference, MemberCon, which is in Leeds in early July this year. The event is a great opportunity to network with fellow exporters and trade professionals while getting practical tips and advice from a brilliant lineup of trade and customs experts. For more information on all of these exciting opportunities, please go to export.org.uk/events. And on the final slide, just a reminder, we will be sending the slides and recording for today's webinar in a follow-up email, which you should get over the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason this email doesn't come through to your main inbox. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of the session in the exit survey. But for now, bye-bye. Thank you.